Today we're really lucky to have Ben Phillips to give us a presentation of his new book published by Polity. The book is How to Fight Inequality. It's published, as I said, in end of 2020 worldwide. Ben is an advisor to the United Nations, to governments, civil society organizations on the issue of inequality. He was a campaigns director for Oxfam and for Action Aid on kind of related issues as well. And he also co-founded the Fight Inequality Alliance, which is an international coalition uniting major non-governmental organizations, union and social movements to build sort of collective power to press for action to tackle inequality. So he's going to talk to us today about this issue and about the book. Ben, I'll give you around maybe 45, 50 minutes to do your talk, and then we open up for Q&A. Ben, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shamal, and thank you to GDI. It's wonderful to be with you, and it's wonderful to have this conversation. I'm just going to share, some things about the book, just to give enough of a kind of basis for a discussion. I'm really keen to hear from you about your experiences, your perspectives, your takes, how you might build on some of the ideas that I set out. So I'm really, really looking forward to the discussion most of all. So we'll try and make sure we leave enough space for that. This is the book, How to Fight Inequality and Why That Fight Needs You. So the best thing to do is to ask your local bookshop to get it. You can also find it on the Polity website. If you look at my Twitter account, Ben Phillips 76, there's also a link in it to that. It is also available from some monstrous monopoly internet-based companies who make their workers piss in bottles and deny them trade union rights whilst making $70 billion during the COVID pandemic. I won't name which one, but you can guess. But I'd rather if you didn't buy it from them, but found it from someone, help local bookstores and find a way to read it that way. 3.7 trillion. 3.7 trillion is the amount that the ILO says workers have lost in the COVID pandemic. 3.9 trillion. That's the amount that Forbes magazine says that billionaires have gained in the COVID pandemic. So there has been a transfer at a time when we're all locked either in our apartments or our mansions. There's been a transfer from ordinary people to the super rich of $4 trillion or thereabout. During this economic crisis, which is the first economic crisis to hit every country in the world, even the 1929 Wall Street crash didn't hit every country in the world, we've shifted from the prior situation, which was that 7 in 10 people were living in countries where inequality has been increasing over the past decades. With COVID, we are probably now in a situation where 10 out of 10 people live in a country where inequality is increasing. But that's not what this talk is about. You can plot on a graph how unequal a country is, and on one axis, and on the other axis, the proportion of people who work as private security guards. What that shows as a kind of proxy is that unequal societies are more violent, less trusting, less functional. So there's something about the human condition that when we stretch and stretch and stretch that elastic of inequality, we break. There's a wonderful metaphor that Polly Toynbee used of a caravan, not in the sense of a white camper van stuck on the back of a car, but in the traditional sense of a caravan that was moving through the desert, a group of folks on camels moving through the desert. If the folks at the front get so far ahead of the rest of the group, then really it ceases to be a group, ceases to be a community. And that's the situation that we've reached with inequality. Unequal societies have much higher murder rates. They have much higher teen pregnancy rates, much higher obesity rates, much higher stress rates. They also have less sustainable and less strong economic development. So even if someone was to say, okay, well, we're going to accept a more violent, more brutal society that spits people out at the end. We know, for example, that when we look at maternal mortality rates, the US, which is the only industrialized country that's chosen not to collectively handle the risk of health catastrophe, has a maternal mortality rate that's double everyone else's. So inequality at its most extreme forms means letting mums die as they give birth. Some people would say, okay, well, we'll buy that, we'll accept that because we're going to get stronger economic growth, or because we are going to get a meritocracy where all can rise. But even the IMF and the Financial Times and the Economist magazine now point out that levels of inequality are also harmful to economic development. And in terms of that notion of meritocracy, the notion of the American dream, it's now more true in Copenhagen than it is in New York. And the World Economic Forum says that entrepreneurship is also higher in Scandinavia than in the States. That's unsurprising because entrepreneurs are people who take risks. Now, if you ask someone to take a risk, as in they'll run a company, the company might go bankrupt, that would be embarrassing, they'd have to start again. That's one type of risk. But if you ask someone to take a risk that says, if you get sick, you could face your personal devastation or death, that's not the type of risk people want to make. So more functional, more equal societies actually enable more effective risk-taking and entrepreneurship. But that's also not what this talk is about, because those ideas that inequality is rising and that inequality is harmful are now very mainstream. So there was a time when I would say that, and people, the polite ones in power, would use words like communist or unrealistic, or don't get it, or don't understand economics, things like that. The polite ones. The less polite ones, wanted to put friends of mine behind bars for saying similar. But then something really strange happened. They started to say, we agree. If you look at the IMF research department, they now produce fantastic research that says pretty much the same points that I've been making today. The UN Sustainable Development Goals pledge in number 10 that inequality should be reduced within and between countries. It's really hard to get an international agreement. It's really hard to get an international agreement that everyone signs. There are very few. If you take something like child rights, people haven't managed to persuade America, for example, that child rights is a thing. So the fact that the Sustainable Development Goals, including this commitment to reduce inequality, were agreed, it was a remarkable turnaround from the previous situation that we'd had with the Millennium Development Goals, where inequality was a blind spot. In fact, it was even a turnaround from a period just a year or so before the Sustainable Development Goals were signed, which is when what was called the high-level panel, that was a group of 3 leaders that included a man called David Cameron, who you might remember from the distant past. They put forward a plan, and it didn't include a goal on inequality. And I and various others spoke up about this and got slapped down. My boss, I was then at Oxfam, my boss got a call saying, who is Ben Phillips and how can you stop him speaking? We were also then told by friends on the inside that the first draft is always better than the final draft. That if in any UN process, if the high-level panel haven't put something in, it's not going in. What you should really be trying to do, they told us, was trying to keep everything that's there in, not trying to get new things in. But we ignored them, thankfully. And thanks to the efforts of civil society organizations, also thanks to the efforts of some great people inside the UN and some governments, the French, for example, and a lot of developing country governments, Sustainable Development Goal number 10 was in the end included. So we have that commitment. That's kind of amazing to have got that. But anyway, this isn't about that either, because I was really excited when that happened. It was actually beyond what was there in the NGO's advocacy goals. We didn't have it in our goals because we thought it was too much of a stretch to say that we could achieve that, and we achieved it. And then very, very little happened. And it was a huge disappointment that the kind of celebratory night was followed by this deeply sober dawn, that we realized that this transformation, that the thing that we had been forbidden to say, the stone that had been thrown away became the cornerstone, the heresy became the gospel, and nothing happened. You could try to list every country that had pledged to reduce inequality, and it was impossible to do so without taking a breath. And yet, if you tried to count on your fingers the countries that were taking action to reduce inequality, you'd have fingers to spare even if you only used one hand. So it's that paradox and that prompt of failure that prompted me to want to look into, well, how do you reduce inequality? If it's not by winning the intellectual argument, if it's not by getting decision makers to formally agree, if it's not by changing the notional high-level consensus, what is it? I went back to look at history, and I looked at 150 years or so of history across the world, and I tried to look at times when things had gone right. I don't want to be a commentator on failure. I want to be an analyst of success, and then hopefully help people replicate success. So I wanted to look at when it had gone well. And I found really two periods, two clumps, if you like, when in the past 150 years or so, there has been success in tackling inequality. Now, success doesn't mean getting to zero difference between those at the top and everyone else. That's never happened. Some people believe that that was the case in hunter-gatherer societies. We don't know. That's not been proven. But in all recorded histories of settled civilizations, we haven't found one where there is zero difference between people at the top and everybody else. So success was really about whether a country had managed for a 5 or 10 or 15-year period, so a sustained medium-term length of time, to substantially reduce the gap between those at the top and the rest. That was my kind of working definition of success. Now, that meant that in a way, if you're reducing inequality, you're winning because it's process. But also in those periods, the culture tended to become more democratic. The ideal of how a society should be becomes more egalitarian as it becomes materially more equal. So what are those two periods? There's one in the 21st century and there's one in the 20th. The one in the 21st century is great because it's recent and we can look at it and we can think that's just how we are. The downside with it is it only really is about one region of the world. It's Latin America from about the year 2000 to about the year 2010, 2012, 2015, something like that. That's when you see in around about 8 to 11 countries in Latin America, sustained and quite remarkable reductions in inequality. And interestingly, though I focused on the economic gap between those at the very top and the rest, in all those cases where inequality reduction was pursued in Latin America, it also reduced other inequalities. So for example, in Brazil, in that period, inequality reduces between the rich and everyone else. Inequality also reduces between whites and indigenous, between whites and Afro-descendant Brazilians, between men and women, between rural and urban. So inequality reduces intersectionally as it reduces on that vertical axis. We can look at the policies, and I did look at the policies. And the thing is that there's not one policy, but it's not that mysterious either. So what's some of the mix that they did in Latin America? One that people focus on a lot is giving people cash. So the idea of a basic income grant has become very attractive and fashionable and kind of Silicon Valley trendy, which should always worry you a bit when you think about what else Silicon Valley is up to. But what's interesting when we look at the cash element, and it was important. So I would say, if people ask me, do you support a basic income grant? Yes. If people ask me, do you support child benefit, which is really a benefit for parents at the time in the life cycle when people get poorer because they're having to look after kids? Yes. Do you support pensions so that people can go old in dignity? Yes. All those things are good. Do you support unemployment insurance? Yes, all of those things are good. Along with the basic income grant, they could all be positive. But that when I looked at the Latin America cases of cash had only been one part. So the World Bank will talk about Brazil in terms of Bolsa Familia, or Mexico at the time in terms of oportunidades. But if they had only done that, they wouldn't have reduced inequality. So it wasn't just that. What else was it? Increasing the wages of workers was a really, really important one, a really important addition to that cash element. Now, you can increase the wages of workers in a number of ways, and across Latin America, the range of ways was pursued. So minimum wages is a very obvious one. Strengthening enforcement and labor relations boards and things like that was also, labor inspectors was also a really important aspect of it. Strengthening trade union rights was also a really important aspect of it. I want to come back to trade unions later on because they're so key in terms of reducing inequality. But that wages and rights at work aspect is important too. Redistributing land is a very important part of reducing inequality, especially in contexts where you have a large rural presence or you have a colonial style or aristocratic model of land tenure, and you're trying to break away from that. That becomes a really important part too. Tackling different forms of discrimination, both by prohibiting the most egregious and obvious forms of discrimination against women, against Black people, against Indigenous people and other people of color, but also affirmative action policies that work to correct the historical discrimination that's taken place. That is also part of the mix. Public services, universal public services, really, really key in all sorts of ways. So when you expand free education or free healthcare or free public transport, you do a number of things at the same time. So one, and again, this is the one that people focused on, but it's actually not the only one or even necessarily the most important, is you strengthen the human development capability of people. So better healthcare means people live longer and are healthier. Better education means they're better able to get fairer returns in the marketplace at work, etc. But that's not the only part. You're also effectively removing a cost, because if you weren't providing it, then people would be paying for it, which is a kind of almost a regressive tax. So you're actually lowering, taking away an outlay that poor people, working class, middle class people would otherwise be paying. So that's a really, really important part as well. There's another part to universal public services, which almost approaches the spiritual, but certainly hits the cultural, and I think it's really, really important too, which is that when people start to use services together, you create the physical conditions in which they do function as part of a shared community. When people are going to the same public parks, not parks they pay for, but public parks that are free, so ordinary people enter them, but are quality so that better off people will enter them. If you do the same for schools, if you do the same for healthcare, you create those collective experiences which otherwise you don't have. There's a beautiful article by Amartya Sen where he talks about the power of free school meals. And he says it's not just that by reducing hunger, you strengthen learning outcomes. He said, we're getting kids of different castes to eat together. They're starting to commune together. I lived in Nairobi. I now live in Rome. When we lived in Nairobi, there's very little that the rich and the poor do together. They don't go to school together. They don't go to hospital together. They don't use transport together, and they don't go to public places together. So the sense in which they're a nation is really stretched outside of sporting events. There are very few occasions at which people come together as one. So the role of public services is really, really key. And there's this paradox, or what seems to be a paradox, although it's really, in a way, not too hard to explain, which is that the way to make public services reduce inequality is not to make them for the poor. It's to make them so that they're universal, so that everybody is using the same services. So that's very important too. Redistributive taxation also plays a key part. Many countries actually don't have a higher rate of income tax that the wealthier would pay. Wealth taxes have been reduced across the world, but they can also play a really important part. So progressive taxation, and then taking taxation away from VAT, away from consumption taxes, especially on things like food, fuel, books, clothes, etc. So that's some of the mix. Now, if you do that mix, you can reduce inequality. But again, this talk isn't really about that either, because that mix is not very mysterious or really that interesting. I think what's interesting is how hard it is to make that mix happen politically, how rare it is to happen. How, for example, in our century, in the 21st century, I can only find this Latin America case to refer to. Now, what's the other case? The other case is much broader and much richer in a way, and much longer. We know when it ends. It starts at different points. It ends really in the 70s. It ends either in the oil crisis, so mid-70s, or at a push, you could say it ends around 1980 with structural adjustment, neoliberalism, Reagan, etc., Pinochet. That you can kind of, that's kind of the end point of what was known as the Golden Age. Now, some people say I'm romantic talking about the Golden Age because there were many problems with it. But boy, what we've had since should make us yearn for some of that. There were problems with it. We can talk about those too. But what's really interesting about the Golden Age period is how broad it is. Now, in terms of the policy mix, interestingly, it's some of the same policy mix that I just talked about from Latin America for the 21st century. So again, it's not that mysterious. So when does it start? For newly independent African and Asian countries, so for example, for Sri Lanka or for a Ghana or a Zambia, it starts with independence. So that really depends on when you get independence. So for Ghanaians, it's from the 50s, but for others, it comes much later. The bulk of African independence from the Anglophone empire is in the 60s or even later. So that's really depends on kind of when you get your freedom. But almost all of the anti-colonial struggles had a core to them, a core driver in them that wasn't just about replacing foreign leaders with local ones, but was a different vision of society in which everybody would prosper. The sense of national destiny and an idea of greater equality were absolutely wrapped up in that meaning and in that practice. As they first took steps into independence, they did pursue bold policies that reduced inequality. In Ghana, for example, thanks to the cocoa workers who were cocoa picking workers who were an enormous amount of the independence struggle, that when you get the shift from the ownership of cocoa from a few at the top that's benefiting foreigners, the white elite and a few in the African elite, and it starts to benefit the whole of society. Initially, the cocoa workers through the Cocoa Marketing Board get free education for all of their kids, Later on, the Cocoa Marketing Board is bringing in such amazing resources that it funds free education for every single child. So we see real transformation there. So that's in the newly independent countries. In Europe, in a lot of Central Europe, it's after 45. So it comes with the end of Second World War, which leads some people to say, and I think this is incorrect, that war leads to reductions in inequality. I think that's an incorrect assumption. War doesn't necessarily lead to reductions in inequality, but also you don't need war. How do we know we don't need war? Because we can look at some other places. Scandinavian reductions in inequality start in around the 30s or even earlier, as do the US reductions in inequality. They start in the 30s too. So it goes much, it doesn't need the Second World War in order to happen. Now, England's a really interesting case in this. England has been having year on year or decade on decade reductions in inequality from about 1870 to about 1970. So England's the longest of the Golden Age period. You have almost 100 years from 1870 to 1970. So that's your the Golden Age. Now, as I mentioned, the policy mix, some of it's relatively familiar from the other things I talked about. What I was interested in both those cases, in the Latin America case and in that 20th century, long mid 20th century Golden Age, much more broad, much more global story, I was interested in how it happened. So the what happened is not so complicated, but how did it happen? Now, here's the interesting thing. that those are such different examples, aren't there? So, you know, the Lula government in Brazil in the 2000s, say, and Sweden in the early 20th century seem like totally different examples, such that the explanation as to how they reduced inequality must surely be totally different, because every culture is different, every time period is different, and yet they're not. They're remarkably similar. So you get this common strands in how it happened. In no case was inequality self-corrected by the market. It was always government. It was always politics and policy. But in no case does it simply depend on a great person happening to be in government. In no case is it given, even when the government is good, even when the government is a Lula. There's a wonderful story, Lyndon B. Johnson saying to Martin Luther King, "I know what I have to do, but you have to make me do it." When I went back and I looked, for example, at the US, that what was it that led to the government taking steps that would reduce inequality? A story that's often told in terms of the boldness of FDR or the idealism of JFK, that when you look at the story underneath that story, you see a Venn diagram of trade unions, activists, and Black organizations. And in the center of that Venn diagram, you see people like A. Philip Randolph, who was a Black trade unionist of the ticket collectors and an activist. He threatened a general strike to both FDR and the Kennedy-Johnson governments. Without that type of pressure, those presidents would not be known as the reforming presidents that they're known as now. And an interesting aspect too is that in that period, in that golden age period, some of this policy mix of redistributive taxation, of expanding the welfare role of the state, of improving people's wages, happens under Republican as well as Democrat governments in the US. And yet when you get to the 1990s and beyond, it happens under neither Republican nor Democrat governments. In other words, one could say that the center left of the 1990s is to the right economically of the center right of the 1950s and 60s. Why? Here's one of the reasons, absolutely crucial. Trade union density, which is just a fancy word for how many people belong to a trade union. When the US, and we find this across countries too, when they were reducing inequality, trade union density was high. When trade union density starts to go down, that's when inequality starts to go up. And the reason is this: working class people and middle class people cannot be powerful on their own, cannot be powerful on their own. They are only ever powerful in concert. All a union is a group of people coming together. That's all it is. And so when they're not doing that, their exploitation goes up. And that happens not just at a company level, it happens at the level of country. That's why, for example, the Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign now in the States says that it's a fusion coalition that creates the potential for inequality reduction in America. That's why when I now look at what's happening in the States, I think if there is to be a reduction in inequality, it won't be because Biden and Harris's personal biography lead to it, but neither do we need to assume that their personal biography leads to the fact that they won't do it. FDR, for example, was an aristocrat who was related to another president, another Roosevelt. He didn't know what it was like to be poor. If the pressure is there, you get the change. So the consistent story is about this pressure. Trade unions forming apart, but forming apart usually of wider and broader movements. Now, I mentioned, for example, how in the Latin America case, we have this story of change. I saw some of this myself when I met the coconut pickers, the Babasu workers. They are from a community called the Colombolo community. Their ancestors ran away from slavery and went to live in the forest in order to be free. And when they ran away to the forest, at that time, the forest was not seen as worth very much. And so it was tolerated that they were there. But then the value of the fruits of the forest started to go up, and the old aristocratic landlords started to believe that they should be in charge of it, started to use dogs and violence and things against the Babasu pickers. I met a wonderful woman called Donna Deje who told me about how she taught herself to read, who told me about how they'd formed this group. And that group secured a change. There's now a law in Brazil that says that those women, those Colombolo women who live in the forest, they have the right to the fruit of the trees. And that right cuts through the ownership right, the land right of the person who owns the forest. So they've changed the concept of property. They've had it enshrined in law because of their action, because they worked together. And they told me about how it was only when they got together in this sisterhood that they were able to achieve this breakthrough, and how they did it by working with the Catholic Church, who, interestingly, in Latin America, often play a progressive role on social and economic interests. Another form of organized power, like trade unions. Churches are a great place for organizing people, getting them to meet, defining morality, defining a common spirit, organizing together. That was how they did it. Now, I told you how this common story appears, because Scandinavia, some people think, well, what Scandinavia's got, their exceptionally equal society, is because Scandis are just these decent, soft, kind, gentle people. They're compromisers. That's just how they are. Their culture is equal. Now I'm getting oh, good. I was worried I'd lost you because the screen froze. Now, but when I went back and looked at the history, I found that wasn't the case. There's a lot of people in the States who are descended from Scandis, descended from Swedes, Norwegians, and others. And when you hear the story as to why they left, their ancestors left, it's quite similar to the Irish migration story. They're fleeing starvation from brutal landlords. So why is it that at the end of the 19th century or beginning of the 20th century, people from an egalitarian society would be fleeing starvation? Because it wasn't an egalitarian society, because it was a brutally feudal society. Finland, which then was still part of the Russian Empire, still had serfdom. Now, Sweden and Norway didn't have serfdom, but they did have a brutal aristocracy. And when workers and small farmers started to organize and to challenge the power of the aristocracy of Scandinavia, they organized strikebreakers. The Norwegian government organized a militia. So this is people who are not in the pay of the state, but who are armed by the state, and they killed strikebreakers. So those images that you saw recently in the States, for example, of this guy, Carl Rittenhouse, who took it upon himself to attack the BLM protest. So that was happening in Norway in the 1920s and 30s. That's what they were doing. They were organizing militia to kill strikers. And it's because workers and small farmers held together in their power that they broke through that threat. So the equality, the egalitarianism that we see now as fundamentally, almost essentially Scandinavian isn't. It is not a story of culture. It's a story of organizing. It was a triumph over a culture by people who organized. This is wonderfully optimistic because it means that if they could do it, anybody could do it. There isn't anything special about them. I know that they like ABBA and have blonde hair, but that's not why they're an equal society. They're an equal society because their ancestors organized. And in every case, when I looked through in history, that was the story too. 3 lessons seem to stand out. The first is you need to be willing to be a troublemaker. Sometimes people will say now, well, these activists, they alienate people. They upset people. Why can't Black Lives Matter be more like Martin Luther King? Well, in 1966, 63% of Americans said that Martin Luther King was divisive. John Lewis, the great civil rights campaigner who then became a congressman, talked about getting into good trouble. Every single successful movement that I look back on in history, whether that's the suffragettes or indigenous people in Bolivia, wherever it is, they were always at the beginning seen as troublemakers. Those who are now put on the stamps were then stamped upon. The formula seems to go like this. If you are never criticized by those in power as a troublemaker, then statistically, on the basis of correlation, your chances of being part of a movement that brings a more equal society seem to be 0. So that's the first. Be willing to be a troublemaker, be undeferential. Second, build power together. build power collectively. That's where the importance of trade unions comes in, but it's also where the importance of going beyond trade unions comes in also, to embrace women's groups, to embrace progressive faith movements, to embrace neighborhood associations, and all different forms of people coming together in groups and groups of groups. And the third lesson seems to be that one needs to go beyond policy and craft a story, craft a narrative. I find it fascinating looking back at the history about how, for example, the phrase welfare state in England doesn't come from a think tanker, doesn't come from a politician, comes from the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, who was defining a moral conception. There's a beautiful movie, I hope you've all seen it, called Roma, a Mexican movie. Beautiful. It's about a domestic servant. And I really hope you go see it if you haven't seen it already. It's a really, really stunning movie. Something amazing happened with that movie. Legislation to strengthen the rights of domestic workers, which had never been passed in Mexico, got over the line, in part enabled by that movie. And yet that movie makes zero policy recommendations. But what it did was it changed the narrative, was it changed the story. And all the great movements of old all had that. When we think, for example, about the music track that came along with the civil rights movement, for example, we see how vital culture and art and creativity have been to movements. The great organizer Joe Hill said this: a pamphlet, however brilliant, will be read once and then put away on the shelf. But a song will be learned by heart and sung over and over again. So those three lessons: be willing to be a troublemaker, build power together, and be a storyteller, seem to be essential for success. Now, is this a recipe that if you apply this formula, you win? No, it's not. There's a beautiful chant in Latin America that says, the people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. Now, sadly, that's not true. The people united are often defeated. But what is true is this: the people disunited are always defeated. So though resistance doesn't always work, acceptance always doesn't work. So this isn't a formula that guarantees success, but it does seem to be a distillation of the lessons of all those who did succeed in sustainably making their societies more equal. So it isn't guaranteed to work, but the alternatives seem guaranteed to fail. One last thing, which is about crises. It is true that crises have been handmaidens of radical change. And so, for example, the brilliant book by Scheidel that is terrifying, that talks about, you need to have this absolute catastrophe if you're going to have a more equal society. He talks, for example, about the Black Death, when so many farm workers were killed in England, that those farm workers who remained could advocate for themselves to get higher wages. It's a deeply depressing but very powerfully argued book. And there's truth in it to that notion that crises can be handmaidens of change. But it misses something. The first is that you don't have to have a crisis in order to win action on inequality, though it can help. But the second, which is more worrying, is this: there's no assurance that the transformational change that you get from a crisis will lead to progressive change. So although it seems impossible to write the story of the FDR government, the best and most progressive government America's ever had, without the Wall Street crash, it's also impossible to write the story of fascism in Central Europe without that same Wall Street crash. The 1970s oil crisis is what births or enables the birth of neoliberalism. The 2008 crash, which seemed to demonstrate the failure of neoliberalism, didn't lead to the punishment of neoliberals. It led to the rise of fascists. So there is no guarantee that this crisis, this COVID crisis, will lead to a more equal society. One can think of it a bit like the heat in a furnace of the glass blower or the blacksmith. That social structures that are hard and difficult to manipulate in normal times, in these times of crisis when they're under heat, suddenly become more malleable. But in which direction will they build? Will they move? Well, that entirely depends on in which direction they are pushed with more force. So this crisis moment, this COVID crisis moment, is an opportunity, a once in a lifetime opportunity. But it's not just an opportunity for us, for those of us who want a more equal society. It is also an opportunity for the terrifying and increasingly strong and close coalition of neoliberals and fascists, for their opportunity to remake society in their image too. So one reason to organize is so that we can make things better. But another reason to organize is to stop those who would make things even worse. What will happen next? I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because though those who say history is made by abstract, arbitrary forces, the movements of economics, are wrong, but so too are those who say history is made only by a few great men. They're wrong too. History is made by thousands and thousands of leaders. So the decisions that will be made that will determine whether or not our society becomes a more equal one will be made by people like us, will be made by people on this webinar. So this isn't something in which you're a spectator. It's something in which you're on the pitch. There are no spectators. We're all in play. Thanks.